Today we're going to be doing an in-depth look at RetroSynth. This is one of Logic's powerful synthesizers, has 4 different engines, it has a ton of features. Even though it looks simple, there's a lot to it. And so we're going to be exploring all the different components, how to program it, how to use it in projects, how to control it with external controllers. We're going to be looking at a lot of different things here in order to help you understand how to use it to its full potential. And so let's jump right in and talk about how this is going to work. Okay, so let's dive into Retro by looking at the 4 different synthesizer engines. These are the 4 buttons here along the top. We have analog, sync, table, and FM. We're going to be starting with analog. This is one of those interesting things where we say analog even though it's clearly a digital synthesizer because it's emulating a digital or an analog synthesizer. And so what we have then are a set of tools which we would normally find in a subtractive synthesizer. We have 2 oscillators. Here's number 1 at the top, and then we have number 2 down here. And so we have those 2 which we can create different sounds with. Everything from a saw to a triangle to we have a square wave which we can modulate. And so we have some different tonal colors we can use as a starting place. Now both of these can be used simultaneously or we can choose one or the other. They go through this information to this mixer, and if we want just one we can go up, if we want just 2 we can go down, or we can do some mix of the 2. We can change the tuning of shape number 2 here, semitones and synths, which is it's the breakdown below a semitone, so in between notes. If we're doing a harmony, for instance, say we're doing a 3rd or a 5th above the root, then sometimes it's pleasant sounding to just push it just slightly higher. And so we can do that. That's a common technique with analog synthesis. Then we have the shape modulation referring to this section. And we can use an LFO, which would be a repetitive shape modulation, or we can use a filter envelope, which is going to give it a distinct shape over time. And so we can actually use that to create a change in that shape. We also have a vibrato option, which is going to do a basic pitch vibrato. Okay, in the next section, we have the filter. This area is really important to the overall concept of subtractive synthesis. This is what the whole subtractive part even means here, as we filter things out of the original sound. So there's a couple key concepts I want to start with. The more complex the initial sounds are, the more we can filter out. Some synthesizers have sine waves as their source material as an oscillator option. This one doesn't even have a sine wave. And I'm on board with that. There's a lot of places we can do sine wave things, but we want to take advantage of a lot of these really great filter options. So you start by choosing which one you want. LP, low pass. HP, high pass. That's just telling you which frequencies are going to pass through and which ones will be filtered. So low pass is going to make it through in this case, and all of this stuff is going to be removed. We turn it on. That's an important part. And then we set the frequency. We can drag this around to wherever we want. Resonance changes it from this shape to sometimes having a boost. Not exactly an accurate drawing, but you get the idea. So there's a little bump there. This is actually not, in this case, just subtracting. It actually could be adding a little bit. But that bump, we put it where some interesting things are in the sound, and it brings out that edge. So we use the resonance in a very valuable way. Then we have 3 ways to modulate this. LFO is going to tie down into this. Envelope is going to tie into this. And filter FM surprising is going to tie into shape number 1. So this means that we are going to use oscillator 1 in order to modulate our cutoff frequency. And so it's going to follow it either in a static way or with the envelope, but it's going to use that as source material. In this case, we have the LFO using that to move it back and forth, or the envelope, again, bringing it up and then bringing it back down. So we get a lot of dynamic options here. The last thing would be the key option, and that just means that on a keyboard where we have notes and we might be playing, we could either set the cutoff to be a very specific frequency and it always stays there, or if we engage this, then if we play a note down here, the filter frequency is going to change and move down. That means we get an even implementation of that frequency across the range depending on where we're playing. And so I think that that's an interesting way to do it. Okay, that's it for the filter area. Let's start now looking at some of the other things. We have an amplitude and then an effect. We can change through some effects, turn it on, adjust the mix, the rate, etc. The volume turns it up and down. Pretty straightforward for that. Okay, so let's take a look now at the next of the engines, which is the sync engine. Now you're going to notice almost everything is exactly the same. We're not looking at a totally different type of synthesis. In fact, what we're looking at here is a simple change in the oscillator engine. We still have shape 1 and shape 2, albeit slightly different options here. And we have modulation and then the overall sync. Now, in my experience, the synths that would have this in the analog domain would be a little bit different than this. However, I do think that it accomplishes a similar end result. So what we're looking at, say we have 2 oscillators and they're at different speeds. Start of the cycle, and then we have the end of the cycle. So what would happen is either this original one, every time that one of the oscillators would start over, it would force the other one to start over too. So in the case of the slower one, it would get going about to there, and then it would start to do this pattern like that. What we end up with is a lot more complex harmonics when this happens, because we get this new wave shape like this that's lining up with this one that's faster. And so it's forcing sync from one to the other. And so that's what these are doing here. We're forcing the sync onto shape 2, and we get a much more complex sound, which then is more interesting when we use some of the filtering and other modulation. Okay, so that's really it for that particular one. What we want to look at now is one of the new types. And I love wavetable synthesis. That's what this type is. It, instead of using oscillators for these, we have this like little wave bank, various sounds, usually really simple and short, that replace what an oscillator would do. So an oscillator is going to essentially have a bunch of these single shapes that just repeat. In this case, we're going to have a bunch of different things that repeat, or it can be just on one, or we can actually sweep through them. So we can move freely through our wave shapes in a wavetable synth, and that's part of the beauty. So we can create these long sounds that change over time. We can just use one little bit and make it sound pretty much like a subtractive synth. In this case, you'll see that we have modulation for this, which allows us to actually move through it. We can load different shapes into this, that wavetable, and everything else is going to be pretty much the same. So now we're getting into the differences here. One of the coolest things, and we're going to look at this separately, is that you can actually import an audio file and make it into a wavetable that can be used here. So you can have like a full finished track. It wouldn't use all of it, but it could actually be analyzed and converted into a wavetable that you can use inside here. We'll look at that in the actual examples. So pretty straightforward, and I don't think there's anything else really to talk about except, I guess the point here takes you through the actual wavetable. So you move that knob and it plays a different part of it, and then we can modulate it to sweep through it. Just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so then that takes us to FM, which is frequency modulation. This is essentially like using a high octane LFO to modulate our initial wave shapes. So we can already do that, then what's the big deal with this? In this case, both of these would be audible oscillators or frequencies. And so typically with an LFO, we're looking at things that are sub-audible or low, or close to sub-audible. And in this case, we're just openly bringing everything up into the audible range, and you end up with some really interesting sounds. And so I think that that's why that this ended up being a different thing. This is made popular by the DX7, a really popular synth in the 90s. And one of the most popular, if not the most popular, digital synth of all time. And so we have this is an interesting implementation. With the DX7, we had 6 operators and little shapes. I'm drawing this out that told us how to use them and what they were doing. In this case, we don't have all of these different operators. We just have the basic carrier and modulator, and then we can change the relationship, because what we're really looking at with FM synthesis is a system that looks at the ratio of the difference between the main carrier, which is the oscillator that's going to be the main output, and then we have this modulator, which is what is going to be changing that or modulating it. So the relationship in pitch between those determines what kind of end resulting sound. Is it prettier? Is it metallic sounding? Is it really ugly sounding? And so what we can do is adjust the ratio in the harmonic and the inharmonic areas, and we get different results. So essentially these are adjusting that frequency, and this one adjusts the overall process of how much modulation is going to take place. We can do a mix between the carrier. If we pull that all the way down, you can hear the carrier by itself, or the modulator as when we go up, and then the shape just changes the overall shape. It was a little vague in the manual, but you end up with some different sounds and things. So it is influencing this process, because when we change the shape of the modulator, it's going to in return change how the modulation process works. Okay, other than that, pretty straightforward. We have this knob in a different place than the other 3. We have this all in the other one as well, so nothing of a surprise in any of those. That brings us down to this section. We have LFO choices and a vibrato tab, so we can change whenever we're using an LFO anywhere else on this instrument. This is where we change the shape, the rate, if we want it to sync, which means put it in the tempo. It's a different sync than when we look at subtractive analog modeled synthesis, but this is just syncing it to tempo, and we have those different shapes. We have the filter envelope, so we have our attack, which is this, initial decay, sustain, and release. So that's this one, that's this one, that's this one, and that's this one. So you can do numerically or drag it around, and then we have a similar thing, and this is for the overall output amplitude. Whoa, a lot of stuff happening here. Oh, we do have glide, which allows us to do glide between notes. We're just still getting started though. When we go down to settings, this pops up. There was a little button right here to engage it. And we can transpose, we can change the tuning, adjust the blend when we're doing things with the mix. Polyphony, you can make this a mono synth, or you can bring up to its full 16 voice capabilities. We can detune the voices from each other, make it sound like it's a poorly functioning analog synthesizer. Has a stereo spread to widen it out, and then a unison option. Unison is one of my favorites. Essentially, we have up to 8 voices for unison. What this does is, say it's a mono synth, which means only one note can play at a time. You can do this and have 8 of those layered simultaneously. And if you do the voice detune, it's going to sound like 8 slightly out of tune voices. And so you get something that's super thick and great sounding. This is perfect, and sometimes with super saws and things. We'll listen to this one for sure. Then we have a little matrix here to do some control. Mod wheel, we can change what it's sent to. Velocity we can change. Aftertouch we can change. And then we can do a custom one to a custom one. Pretty straightforward for that. Some of these we'll be looking at again. Still not quite done. When we are in the table mode, the wavetable, we have, this is what it looks like normally without that mode, but in the wave, we actually have those two get moved into one side, and then this is where we set our audio file analysis mode if we're going to import our own files. So that's an important thing when we do our own original wavetable options. Okay, that's it for those 4 modes. What I want to do now is actually move on, and we are going to start looking at using this instrument before we look at some of the external elements and things that we can incorporate into it. Okay, so now let's actually take a look at this instrument in some more practical terms, actually listening to it. First thing I want to do is run a test, because this is a subtractive synthesizer. It's very similar to what we would expect from like Model D or Mini Moog. As the original would be the Mini Moog from Moog synthesizers, but I have one of the new emulators, the one that's modeled off it from Behringer, which is the Model D, and it's a full analog synthesizer, essentially the same circuitry as the Mini Moog, and I have it right here, and we have them side by side on these 2 tracks, and I spent a little time seeing if I could get it into the same place in terms of sound, or close. I couldn't get it exactly for a number of reasons, but pretty close. So that would be the retro synth. Very similar sounding external instrument patch. So the MIDI's being sent out to the Model D, and then the analog signals coming into the interface and being put into Logic. So I can put them right next to each other. Now, it is very difficult to get exactly the same, but there's a few things that each of these things do which just are amazing compared to the other. So for instance, if I'm using the Model D here, I've got 3 oscillators instead of the 2 here, and I can really easily, if I wanted to, add in a 3rd one. And we have control like that right off the bat. So I've got additional things that are really nice about the Model D. With the retro synth, I have a number of different features which get me to a much bigger sound really easily. Not only do we have polyphony, which the Model D is a mono synth, but I can either have the tuning be perfect or pull it out a little bit between the notes. I have a stereo spread option, which instantly makes the sound much bigger. And we also have unison. Unison is the one that lets me double up the voices, so I could do a 2 voice, 8 voice. Now that's stuff I can't do inside the Model D at all. Just like that. I'm going to reset the default for a minute because this is where I always start with this instrument. You'll see what we have here with the default patch. So I can't get the exact sound, partly because I can never have the stereo element. This is it's not only a mono synth, but it doesn't even have a stereo output. So I'd have to use some other effects to get it there. But I do have this filter. We can actually take this down a little bit. So you can't see what I'm doing on the Model D, but I will put a picture up on the screen so you get a sense for what we're looking at. I can do some things with that I can't really easily do with the retro synth in terms of some of the edge and some of the richness of the analog circuitry, which even though is emulated fairly well here, I mean, we have all of these different low-pass filters, band-pass, high-pass, other filters, which can get us to a number of different places. What the Model D does in its own little niche is just incredible. What the retro synth does is much more expansive, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's put that away for a minute. What I want to do, though, is come through and actually demonstrate some of the topics we've talked about with some of these things. So, for instance, we explained the analog part pretty well. We have our different wave shapes. But with the sync, what I want to do is listen to this a little bit. So you get a much different little edge to that when it's when the two shapes are sunk off each other. We can also, of course, modulate that. So modulation is one of the key elements for all of these different synthesis engines here. For instance, if I want to sync this off the filter envelope, let's close our settings here. This is the filter envelope. I can have this build in over time, and then that edginess from the sync is going to build in. So you get the really rich parts of that, and we can change how much this is doing depending on where that knob is. It actually bypasses that, looks like, when it's attached to the filter envelope. So we can adjust this here, make it really short. Or with the LFO, so the repeating, let's increase the rate.
almost up into the range of frequency modulated synthesis. So keep in mind every time we have one of these things that says LFO or filter envelope that we can control how much is in there based on those other modulators. The table, the wavetable, this is by far one of my favorites. We're looking at how to control this with external modulators coming up. But for now, let's look at some of the things we can do with this. So for instance, we can modulate the shape, again using the filter envelope down here or the LFO. But because we have so many options here inside Logic, we're going to load up one of our MIDI effects with the modulator. And we're going to do our wave shape as our destination. So I'm going to click over here for my LFO section. Under the 2 option, we're going to say Learn Plugin Parameter. I'm going to click the wave shape. Now, this LFO is controlling that knob, but we're going to switch this to more of a sample and hold or randomize function. And let's up the speed. So we can do some really cool things with that. And now change the wave shape. This is going through that table and having it change throughout all of it. So we could actually change our wavetable. And while we could use the filter envelope here for this, we could also, if we wanted to, use the envelope here in our MIDI effects for the same thing. And you can see how we can do that. Now, why would we want to do that instead of using the one that's actually built into this? Because maybe we want a separate envelope for that, while we have a filter envelope actually happening over here. Let's put that one back there. So we would have a separate filter, an envelope happening with this set of controls, and then changing the shape with a different envelope with our MIDI effect. So that's pretty cool. Let's see, have so many of these options, but you can also load in something else if you want to. So this is where we looked at a little bit with our additional settings. We're going to do just normal for our audio file analysis. Let's do create wavetable from audio file. And then let's just see what random file I have on my desktop. It didn't like that file. I'm not surprised. I think I know what that file is. Let's try this one. It says timbral information for a single waveform was detected. Formant modulation is available by switching the modulation knob to formant, which is right here. Let's turn off that envelope for a second. Okay, so let's do highly relaxed file analysis. Because what was happening was it's looking for something very specific, and now if by relaxing it, I can use many different types of files. So we're going to go back to the original one, for instance, which is a song, 29 waveforms. It's still just breaking it down by little individual sections, but if I do this highly selective, I don't think anything would be created. But let's go back to highly relaxed. Turn on our envelope. But different types of source material are going to produce different types of results for this. We can go back to the shape. Interesting sounds. For the FM, we're looking at a lot of bell-like metallic sounds for the most part. Let's see if we can load up a default here. That would be this one. So digital chimes. Nope, that's FM bells. So we hear a lot of different things with this. What we're looking at is the modulator, which when I have this mixed up to that, you don't hear anything when I do this because we're just hearing the modulator, but we would hear the harmonic and inharmonic content of the modulator being changed and the overall wave shape changing. And then we have the carrier, which is this. And as we turn up the FM amount, the two are going to be modulated together. We get just a lot of really cool sounds from this. And so I think that this engine is one of the most interesting, perhaps one of the hardest to understand and use. Okay, I think that's the amount I wanted to demonstrate for these engines. Now that we've talked about them and looked at them, we've done a little demoing with them, I want to shift gear and look at controlling them with some external controllers. And then I want to return back into this project and actually look at using retro synth a little bit in this the song project.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some external ways to control retro. This is a collection of things which we could use. Everything from a hands-free option with the leap motion, which I really love, to the Hornberg. This is a breath controller, super handy. It's a very high quality HB1, made in Germany. And then we have the Expressive E Touche, the full version of this, which is amazing. So each of these things could be used to control various parameters inside this instrument. It makes it very handy. So I want to walk you through just one of the ways to do this to get this all connected. On the Hornberg, for instance, which I have already connected, I can come through and choose different parameters by clicking the button, and CC is one of them, and then I can choose which CC data point to use. We're going to use 16.
Then, when I blow on the actual mouthpiece, you'll see that moving. So now, in Logic, I'm going to come over here to one of our options. This is one of my favorites for the whole program, the Smart Controls. It'll look like this on the screen when you first do this. And you click on the eye, and I've already got one parameter mapped here just so I could get that prepped up. But what we could do, if we open that up, I can come over here and choose any of the parameters for things that are volume, the main channel, or in retro synth. You can see we have some non-automatable items, but under oscillator, for instance, I could do oscillator 1 shape. Once I have that selected, then I could come down here to the Learn option for the external assignment, click Learn, and add some data. And now you could see the first object here is moving. Let's actually go to the actual retro synth here so you can look at the shape 1 now. So then I can push a note. And so you can see I can control the shape of that oscillator with a breath controller. We could do almost anything we want with this. So I could come through here. Let's do filter cutoff. And so I can change the frequency of the cutoff filter with a breath controller. Super handy. It would work the same for almost any one of these. For instance, I can plug in this unit right here. And I don't know. Let's learn this. There we go. So now I could use this, and it's doing a similar thing. So I can really easily just see which part. This looks like I got the top. There's 4 different axis directions on this, and so it's this one here that I got. So now I can very subtly control the filter using this whole unit. Cool. So all of these tools can go into making a more realistic performance with the synthesizer. We can use this on any one of the parameters that are automatable and control them. Let's actually look at the ones that weren't for a second, just so you have an idea. Global, things like tuning, polyphony. I do want to point out that we can still control these parameters. We just can't create automation for them. So if we were doing this in a live situation or recording this into an audio file, we could still get away with this. It's just not going to be able to be written into the automation. Okay, that's what I wanted to look at for using some of the external things. Some really cool options out there. This is just a small handful. We didn't even look at the leap motion. This uses infrared and cameras to track hand motion. You can do all the same stuff without touching anything. So breath, touchless, and then a physical thing here that touch with your hands. Or I suppose you could use this as a foot controller. But a lot of different options. Okay, that's it for this section. Let's move on and actually look at a song where this instrument is being used in it and talk about perhaps some of the techniques in that specific production environment. Okay, so here we are inside a project that I used recently for one of the other live streams we were doing, but I want to showcase the retro synth's part in this because it does play a part. I want to keep, for now, we don't need any vocals on this. We're just going to do instrumentals for the moment. Let's listen a little bit at the beginning and know that this is in a rough state still because it was originally done for 360 And now this is going to be a stereo conversion, but it hasn't been fully converted yet. So this is the bass part right here, and it's the foundational section of the whole arrangement. It works in conjunction. I just was adjusting the drums a little bit to get to where we wanted to be with it, but it works in conjunction with the drums and should form kind of that the foundation for the entire track with those two elements. I like the retro synth for this a lot of times because it really does fill out the spectrum. It plays really consistently in the low range. And it's really easy to get it exactly how I want it. So, right this moment, we have it going through a few different effects. Let's turn all of those off for the moment so we could hear without it. Starting at this first section. So it's going through a stereo spread or imager in one place and spread in another. I don't know if we need both of those on for the stereo version of this project, but I do really enjoy spreading this instrument out. There's a lot of bass instruments which we couldn't spread out as easily. Say that we leave off the Reason rack for now, which is doing just a little bit of coloration with the distortion, and then looks like minimal with the EQ. But then we have the spread from Logic on. The reason why this effect works really well with the retro synth is because there's quite a bit of high frequency content in the retro synth. So it's a low instrument, but it has the high elements due to the wave shapes that we're using and the filter. We could add more if we wanted, but it allows us to come through and spread it out with the stereo spread, which is using frequencies to split it between the left and the right. So I can do that here. And then if we're careful and don't do too much or in the wrong frequencies, it can just add a nice wider bass sound to the whole thing. You'll notice I have the upper frequencies inverted, so we're maintaining some hope. Let me put the correlation meter afterwards here. Let's see if we're actually staying in the positive with our correlation. Oh yeah. Except at the end of the notes, which I'm okay with. The bulk of the notes are staying in the positive. What this correlation meter does, this is a Logic effect. It tells us with stereo files or stereo sounds if the left and the right are additive. It means if they're sum to mono, are they going to actually, in terms of phase, remain positive, or if you were to sum it to mono, if it would actually cancel some of itself out and actually lose some of the sound. So in the bulk of the sound, we're adding it, and then it does at the end of the tail go into the negative. But it would only be an issue if we were mono summing, which for the most part we don't do. It still happens. Let me show you mono for this, what that sounds like if it's summed together. So we do lose the stereo effect. We do lose a little bit of the sound at various places, but for the most part, I think we're okay. As long as people are listening in stereo for the most part. Okay, so then this instrument does a pretty good job. When we get down in this song to the later section, we are using, it looks like, the exact same instrument. I don't see any differences here. It's just a matter of, in this case, using some additional effects. So it looks like we have a much more bold EQ choice here. So we're going from one to the next. That's the same patch with a different EQ and just in a different register. I mean, same exact settings, just a little different EQ in a different register. That right there shows you how flexible that sound can be, going from a real bass sound to more of a harmony type sound. So I think that that's a pretty strong indication. Here's what that sounds like with all the instruments. And then it goes back to more of a bass roll at that next section. Okay, so we could be using retro synth in a lot of different roles here. We could switch out our key part with one of the other Wavetable or FM. We could do the 777 down here as one of the FM type pads. We've got this section down here. We could almost get away with some of the FM options with that as well. I mean, there's a lot of colors that this synth is capable of. And I think that's one of the strengths of the instrument, is actually doing that. So keep that in mind as you're working with this, that you can come up with some really cool sounds, and it can be very flexible. We're not looking through all of those. This is more of a how-to on the retro synth, but then the what you want to do with it, the creative part, that's going to be up to you and how you use it and exploring and experimenting with it. As a bonus, if you want to make one of the biggest synth sounds ever, something that is just like bleeding and edgy and massive, then there's a couple things you can do to get there. One of them is make sure you turn off all the voice detunes so you don't get any of that. You don't want any of that. You want to turn unison all the way up to 8. And then we can mess around with our filter, envelope, and frequency. But you can see what I have for my wave shapes here. These are pretty, we can adjust them. But I do think it makes a difference to have them be different. And if we do put them in the pulse here, we could actually have that. I think we don't want to do too much with that. Let's leave that up at the default. Let's see, 0. But we have these two here. And then I switched the filter to edgy, the 24 decibel per octave. And then you can see how much of a resonance here I've got. So one thing we don't want is any pitch changes, because if you have a little bit of pitch change, it's going to do those beats as they combine, and you'll end up losing some of the impact. But then we set our envelope filter so that it just pops in soon, but not immediately. Massive and big, and we can do something like the arpeggiator now. Get some huge sounds that way. So just one thing to think about is to not use any of the pitch, but use all the other features to really build up something massive. The last thing I would say is I had the key option turned up so that that filter moves around the keyboard depending on which key is being pressed. Without that, it still sounds good, but it certainly, I think, is a little bit more impactful with it. Okay, let's move on to the summary.
Okay, well that's it. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at retro synth. If you're interested in more of these type of videos, comment below. Let us know, because we can make more of these. I think the plan is to potentially do so, but I think that a little bit bigger videos like this, we want to make sure that's something you're interested in. So comment and like this video, share it. If you really want more like this, then support the channel. That'd be great. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.